thing I really loved about this book is the way you put 𝗘𝘃𝗲 in comparative perspective, as you have today, discussing, for example, him in comparison to Shakespeare, Dante, other poets from the West. I was wondering if you could talk about that in terms of how it allows us to focus not on our differences, but on our similarities, on common themes that poets around the world and all of us as humans confront of issues from sorrow to loss, to suffering, to compassion. To me, this is what is so valuable and so important about work like this, is that it reminds us of our common humanity.
Yes, I absolutely agree. Reading a poet like 𝗘𝘃𝗲 tells you that at root we have a common humanity and our values are the same. And there's such an effort at the moment, for example, by the Chinese government to suggest that actually there's a Chinese way, and it is distinct from the Western way. Western values of humanity, human values, liberal values, but ideas about human rights and everything else that don't pertain to China. We've always done differently, and of course, when you look at the great productions of China, there are many things in common. Even you could look today and say it's uncanny the way the Communist Party have replicated the structures of governance that the Ming dynasty and the Qing dynasty had, an authoritarian bureaucracy. That's what they've done. But it needn't always have been like that, and it wasn't always like that. And people in the 17th century were arguing about a more open society and the rule of law. There's a great book written in the 17th century on why we've got to have the rule of law. So it's diminishing China's incredible achievements to suggest that somehow it's on this one path. And of course, the great literary figures just tell you that it's not. And that's what I love about 𝗘𝘃𝗲. But having travelled with him, I just love him as a person. He's just really frustrating and all the rest. But it's so touching, and the effort he makes to tell you how he feels. Has anybody in the whole of history before the 8th century ever given such an account of themselves, an interior portrait? And I don't think they have. I can't think of anybody who has, so that's wonderful. In my academic work, I'm quite interested in great 8th century scholars in the West, like Alcuin. And actually, Alcuin is, writes very tender poetry about his love for his male friends, and they're very touching documents. It's quite interesting to compare 8th century scholars, exact contemporaries, but 𝗘𝘃𝗲's portrait of his own life and feelings is on a completely different level. But then China itself was on a completely different level. A.C. Graham, in his book on the Tang poetry, says that there are these moments in the history of poetry where things really obviously change in a very short time, and the poetry becomes much denser, much richer, more self-reflexive. 16th century England's a classic case where the poetry just changes, and suddenly you give birth to Shakespeare. You could argue it doesn't really happen in France until the 19th century, but in China it happens in the 8th century. And 𝗘𝘃𝗲's the first great example of that. And of course he shapes the poetic tradition from then on. Fantastically influential on everybody else, especially in times of war and destruction.